Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are in Revelation chapter 8 this week. Let's go ahead and read it, and we'll get into it. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 8, it says, "When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven, lasting about half an hour. I saw 7 angels who were standing in front of God, and they were given 7 trumpets. Another angel came and stood before the altar, and he was holding a golden censer, and he was given a large quantity of incense so that he could offer it, along with the prayers of all God's holy people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of incense with the prayers of the saints rose up from the hand of the angel in front of God, and then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it on the earth. And there were crashes of thunder, loud rumblings, lightning, and an earthquake." We're getting there. We're moving along. As always, before we break down any part of Scripture, we want to make sure we put it in our context. So very briefly, and if you haven't heard all this before, go back and watch the first week in this study of Revelation series. It was written by the Apostle John, or one of John's disciples named John, just because the writing style is very similar to what we see in the Gospels in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And it was written to encourage Christians who were suffering on the fringes of society, who were basically being oppressed by the power structures in their world. And they were losing everything because they chose to follow Jesus. And some of them were also becoming complacent in their faith and were abusing it. So it was written to encourage and inspire Christians to live their lives the way Christ wants us to, by showing them God's perspective on their current situation, and by showing them that God's going to make things right in the end, that God is going to purify this world of corruption and evil and anything that is twisted from what his original intent was to be. And so we are in the second part of it, where we were in the throne room, or on the island of Patmos during the 7 letters, and then we get to the throne room of heaven where John is having this vision. And thus far, it started out with this worship service, right? So we saw that God was on the throne in the center of the room, and then there was the 4 creatures around it, and then the 24 elders, and it was this ceremony that was kind of leading towards this worship of God, but it was ultimately building towards God unveiling and finally completing his rescue plan, where all evil, all pain, all suffering, all that is done away with, because that's not what God intended his creation to be. And the whys and all that, that's for another study. But basically, the Lamb, Jesus, starts breaking the seals that are holding shut the scroll that's in God's right hand. And that scroll is a royal edict, right? It's important that we remember that this is God's edict to finally end evil once and for all, and bring about eternal peace and justice and creation as it is supposed to be. And so we've been reading the last several weeks about the Lamb breaking these seals. We saw in the first 4 seals where evil being exposed, right? Evil was let loose so that it could be fully exposed, so that the disease could be diagnosed properly. And then seals 5 and 6 are God curing the disease, God purging his creation of evil. And then, again, for more information on that, watch the last several of these videos. And then we get to today's, which is the last seal. So this is something that we've been building up towards for a long time. And you'd think like this is going to be it. We're going to see everything being made right, and it's just going to be incredible. And we get there, and it's the Gettysburg Address. What do I mean by that? So President Abraham Lincoln, when he gave the Gettysburg Address, there was another guy who spoke before him, and the guy spoke for a long time, and he got a big standing ovation afterwards, and everybody was, well, it was such a great speech, blah, blah, blah. And President Lincoln goes up, and he gives the Gettysburg Address, to mark the anniversary of that battle. And, if you've ever had to read that or memorize it in school, it's very, very powerful. And after he finished that address, there was silence. Nobody clapped. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. It was just one of those moments where silence was the only appropriate response. It was just, you were lost in the power of it. That's exactly what's happening here in heaven. Once that 7th seal is broken and the Lamb finishes his work, there's nothing to do but sit in silence. Not because you're bored, not because creation doesn't care, but because there is no amount of applause that is big enough or loud enough. There's no amount of cheering that is joyous enough. It is just silence is the only reaction to the work of Christ. And it's why we see kind of there's a silence that happened after the crucifixion. There's silence, because that's the only way you can truly and fully respond to Christ. Our words fail to describe what he has done for us. Silence is the only thing pure enough in this moment where that seventh seal is finally broken. And John says there was silence in heaven for about 30 minutes. Now, Numbers and Revelation typically have pretty deep meaning. There's not really any that can truly be attributed to this. Now, it just shows that it was an amount of time. Was it literally 30 minutes? Maybe. Time in heaven works different than it does on earth. So that's not the point that you need to take away from here. The point is that the work is complete. And you might be like, well, this is chapter 8. There's like 20 some chapters in Revelation, right? Like what else is there to say? Well, we're going to talk about this more next week. We're only going to get to verse 5 today, as I read, of chapter 8. But we're going to talk more about the recapitulation, about John's writing style, and the way that he structures his writings is very much circular. He starts over a lot. If you were with us through our study of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you know he starts over a lot. Like, that's his style. These visions are recapitulatory. I don't mean that John didn't have 3 visions. I mean that he's seeing the same thing 3 times, just from a different viewpoint. And we'll talk about that more next week. But all you need to know right now is that in the same way that there was a ceremony before the breaking of the seals began, there was a thing that had to happen to build up to that. It's the same for the next septenary, a set of 7. That's what septenary means. We're going to use that word a lot. So commit it to memory, septenary, because there's 3 big septenaries in the book of Revelation, sets of 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. And they're all the same vision, just from a different angle. But again, we'll talk about that more next week. But what we see now in the from verses 2 through 5 is the prep work, the thing that has to happen before the vision starts again. And so immediately John jumps into, he says there's 7 angels before the throne of God. And these 7 angels are pretty unanimously agreed upon to be the 7 archangels of Jewish tradition. I mean, you've got to remember that the context we're in, Revelation, is an apocalypse, which is a genre that was really popular around the time John was writing. This wasn't just a fringe thing that nobody knew about. Like, there were a lot of these kind of apocalyptic writings out there, these revealing a bigger reality that was very much about God bringing in his new golden age. And so in that vein, there's a repetition of 7 archangels. In the Bible itself, we only know 2 of them. Right? There's only 2 that are mentioned by name. We have Michael and we have Gabriel. And they all have the L suffix of their names, and that refers to their job and their role. That's part of it. And so the other ones are Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Sariel, and Remiel. And they're mentioned, like I said, in these other apocalypses. Tobit first, Enoch. But John, it's pretty obvious that's what he's referencing here. But he doesn't name them here because it's not the point, right? That's not what's going on. Doesn't matter. It matters what their role is, and they're given trumpets each. And trumpets are very significant because in the Jewish world, trumpets are really used for one of 2 things. They're used in the worship at the temple, and they're used in battles to sound the alarm. That's what trumpets were. And as we're going to see as we talk next week and we get into the trumpet septenary, we'll see that that's pretty much exactly what they're used for here as well. So put that in your brain, lock it in there, and let's save it for next few weeks. And then before those 7 angels can go and start blowing their trumpets, an 8th angel shows up. We don't know who he is. There's no real identity of him, but he is given another job. He's given a lot of incense. Now, if you don't know exactly what incense is, it's basically aromatic things you burn that smell good. So you don't smoke it, you light it and it smells good. And in the ancient world, especially in the Jewish temple, it was meant to signify the prayers of the people going up to God. It was a sacrifice made to God. It was expensive. And incense was expensive back then. And so he's given this big pile of incense to be offered up along with the prayers of God's holy people, which we saw earlier, that was filling the throne room of heaven there. The prayers of us, our prayers, are show up in the throne room of heaven as incense being offered up. They're sweet smelling to God. And that's, like we talked about then, just want to recap that. What you need to know here about this is it shows the dynamic between heaven and us. That the book of Revelation as a whole is very much about God acting on creation and not the other way around. It's very much that direction, heaven to earth. But we see here that it's not one directional. That our prayers and our thoughts and the prayers lifted up to God, they show up in the throne room. So that's, again, it should just be really encouraging that that's what your prayers show up as, that God hears them, that he knows them, they're sweet smelling to him. And then that angel, he takes a golden censer, which is like a really flat bowl. It's almost like a plate, but it's a bowl. And he fills it with fire from that altar that he just sacrificed the incense and the prayers of the Holy of God's people on. He fills it with fire and he casts it down to earth. Now this is significant for us because we hear Christ say something almost identical. In Luke chapter 12, verse 49 to 51, he says, I came to throw fire upon the earth, and I wish it were already alight. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and I am under huge pressure until it's happened. Do you suppose I've come to give peace on the earth? No, let me tell you, but rather division. See, Christ's work has been always to bring about peace on earth. But just like in the seals, we see that in order for the disease to be cured, the disease being evil, it has to be exposed first. And so we see this angel casting fire upon the earth. And this is when it begins again. The process of exposing evil and curing evil. And the trumpets are going to be the process. It's going to be a parallel to the 10 plagues. Again, this work of Revelation, even from a non-religious standpoint, is brilliant. Just the themes it draws on, the parallels it makes, it is a brilliant piece of literature. But it's even more powerful when you put it in the context of Scripture as a whole. And the very last thing we see is thunder and lightning and rumblings and earthquakes. Revelation is a loud book. I said this several weeks ago. Revelation is very loud. Noise plays a big role in this. John is very intentional about communicating the sounds he's hearing. And so here, when the fire is cast upon the earth, we hear that there are thunder and lightning and rumblings. What does that mean? Every time we see this, it means God is coming. God is about to show up. We see it in Revelation 4, we see it in Revelation 10, we see it in Revelation 11, we see it in Revelation 16. And go back, we see it throughout Scripture. Mount Sinai, the exact same thing when God shows up to meet with Moses, lightning, thunder, rumblings, earthquakes. This is the sign that God is about to move. So, we'll talk about it more next week, but we'll just talk about it more next week about how the trumpets are a recapitulation of the seals. But just be ready. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.